Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name's Naomi and I'm a presbyter in the North Kent Methodist Circuit. And today's guest is Kathy Bevan. Welcome, Kathy.
Hello, nice to be with you.
It's lovely to have you here. So Kathy is the Evangelism and Justice Enabler for the Newcastle-Upon-Tyne Methodist District and also a student deacon studying part-time at the Queen's Foundation. Her work across the district involves supporting churches to consider how they might partner with their communities in the work of social action and social justice, and encouraging and enabling them to share their stories of lives transformed by relationship with Jesus. That all sounds fantastic. It's great to have you here, Kathy. And joining us from JPIT today is Thomas Niblett, JPIT's intern for the Constituency Action Network. Welcome, Thomas.
Hello.
So, Kathy, we'd love to start by asking you our usual question that we throw at most of our guests. Does politics belong in the pulpit?
I think absolutely yes. In that politics is about life and how we live together. And we absolutely should be talking about that from the pulpit. I guess we get into difficulty when we start getting into party politics. But in terms of politics being about that means of how we are as society, absolutely we should be talking about that just as Jesus did.
Mm, mm. Yes, that's a very good example to follow, isn't it?
Yeah. Can't go wrong.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kathy. Okay, so just to set the context for our conversation today, obviously we're recording this in advance, so the headlines will have changed. But as we're recording this, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake has hit the Philippines. Keir Starmer is preparing to cut net zero spending to increase the defense budget. Israel has launched strikes on Iran this morning, defying Trump and threatening escalation. European leaders are backing Zelensky's call for a meeting with Putin in London over the Ukraine-Russia war. The lectionary readings that we'll be looking at today for Sunday, the 21st of June, are Genesis 21, verses 8 to 21, Psalm 86, verses 1 to 10 and 16 to 17, Romans chapter 6, verses 1b to 11, and Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 to 39. If you wish, you can also look at the alternative readings, which are Jeremiah 20, verses 7 to 13, and Psalm 69, verses 7 to 10, 11 to 15, and 16 to 18. In terms of our awareness days, we have Pride Month happening at the moment, and there's World Refugee Day on the 20th of June and Sanctuary Sunday on the 21st of June. So with all of that in mind, let's dig into the texts that we have today. And we're going to be starting with the Psalm and with Romans to sort of set the background a little bit. So, Kathy, I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether you'd like to start with the Psalm or with Romans.
Yeah, and I think both of these passages really sort of set the backdrop to the gospel passage that we'll come to a little bit later on. And certainly in the Psalm, there's that element of calling out to God in a time of danger, and that sort of remembrance of how God has saved in the past and that trust that God will save again. Um, but also within that, there's the that sort of call to God to strengthen us, that remembrance that all the way through we're still learning, we're still reliant on God. And that we don't do any of our justice seeking work in our own strength. It's all in God's strength. So even within that psalm that's crying out to God for to be saved, to be rescued, to be preserved from all of the things that are happening, there's also that call alongside it to keep teaching us, keep strengthening us, and keep us sort of moving forward in God's strength. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember as we're going about this work of justice seeking and trying to bring about God's kingdom in tiny ways around our communities.
Mm. I think that's such a a helpful thing to remember because that justice seeking work is hard sometimes, isn't it? To not try and do that in our own strength, but to call out for God's strength and rely on that. That's really
Yes.
helpful. Thomas, did
Mm.
you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, I think that's it's a very helpful psalm. And the psalms around supplication. Supplication is an interesting word because um, I think it can be a little bit challenging, but I quite like it. And to jump ahead slightly to the Genesis, I think it links to Hagar there. That there's that kind of full reliance on God, but a confidence in it. Um, I also think it's interesting to think about how it challenges us around being countercultural.
Mm,
To be quite think it's something we think about at JPIT is where is it good to kind of be in line with, what people are unhappy about, maybe, but also as Christians, we've got a distinctive call to be kind of countercultural in the work we do. One of the awareness days is Sanctuary Sunday, and it reminded me, or I think that's a good example because the whole definition of providing sanctuary is probably countercultural, or the person wouldn't need sanctuary in the first place, right? It's not going to be a popular thing to do. And I listened to a podcast recently from BBC Sounds called In Detail, and it's about the story of Viraj Mendes in the 1980s, who was a man who was given sanctuary, political sanctuary, by an Anglican church in Hulme in Manchester. I'd really recommend going and having a listen. He was a Sri Lankan man who felt unsafe to go back to Sri Lanka after his visa expired, and the church gave him sanctuary for several years, and it became a political moment in Manchester's politics. And I thought it was a great example because it was real bravery, and it
Mm.
ended up with a police raid to get him out. It's a very, very exciting story. Do go and listen. But I was listening to that recently, and it made me think that's it takes bravery to give sanctuary, to be countercultural. It took bravery from that church community and that priest, um, and this sort of psalm to really describe in quite a lot of detail how um, we are in supplication to God and how God can gladden our souls and will listen to us and will answer us. That's really important if we're going to commit to doing, the gospel call of doing difficult countercultural things in the name of justice and Christ's justice. So I think it's really helpful, especially as you say, Kathy has some background to the rest of the passages.
mm,
Yeah, it's a powerful one.
yes, and that background, again, jumping ahead, but that's going to be really key when we get to the Matthew passage, isn't it? That sense of being
It is, yes.
countercultural and the kind of response that we provoke through that justice-seeking work.
And being bold and confident in Christ as well. That sort of threads through all of these readings, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And Thomas, there was something that struck me as being very Japhet in this psalm, in the right at the beginning, where it says, "I am poor and needy," and the sense
Mm,
that this is coming in the voice of the person who is in need. It's not someone speaking for them. It's that
mm.
person's voice naming their situation and calling out to God, and how important that is. I know that's a big part of Japhet's work, isn't it? And enabling people to have a voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we really want to put, one of our hopes is to have the people who are poor or suffering poverty and other injustices, marginalizations, that they're at the center, which I think is a really nice phrase, to be at the center, to be kind of the point, but also to be known by everyone, to not be ignored or sidelined. Um, and I think it's nice that it's a confidence to start a psalm with quite a clear statement of your identity marker, that you are feeling poor and needy. You're being very clear. You're being very honest and truthful with God.
Mhm.
And it makes me think that the Bible is most stories of people in the Bible, with I guess a few notable exceptions, but I guess if you add them up, it's probably mostly about people who are not powerful, right? The Bible is not really a book about um, powerful rulers, or if it is, it's told by people who are looking on that power. That it's definitely the pattern we see is we have to remember that compared to them, we in Western and wealthy societies have so much more kind of material goods, and we have a much more privileged position than a lot of the characters and writers
Mm.
of our Bible stories. And I think this is a good example of a lot of the Psalms come from someone who is feeling confident in their neediness of God, which sometimes we could probably get away without feeling particularly needy, given our material wealth, right? That's
Mm,
part of the
Mm.
challenge.
mm. Yes, and like Kathy was saying earlier, then thinking, well, I can do all this in my own strength because I've got the resources and I don't need to
Mm.
rely on God. Mm. Kathy, did you want to come on to the Romans now and talk a bit more about how
Oh,
that
yes.
provides a backdrop?
Yeah, so I think with the Romans passage in the first part of Romans, w Paul is speaking about grace and forgiveness, and then in chapter 6, there's sort of that switch where it moves into what this actually means in practice, and that actually this is all great to have this grace to be know ourselves forgiven, but actually it means some pretty tough stuff. This is not straightforward. It's not just a situation where we're passive. We have to be sort of active in this process too.
Mm.
And I think the things that came through for me in this were around the um, dying to self, that humility that comes through this passage and through the passage from Matthew's Gospel, but also that promise of new life. Um, that is reflected in 2 Corinthians and that lovely verse about being a new creation. The old has passed, the new has come. Um, and I think it's that sort of ongoing process of dying to self, which I know for me is something that I need to remember daily. It's not a once and done kind of thing. Self seems to rise up on a very regular basis, and needs to sort of um, remember that actually, again, we work in the power of Christ, not in our own strength. And sometimes I think that um, almost gets picked up as meaning that we don't matter. And I don't think that's the way that Jesus intends it to be. Um, I'm reminded of a quote actually. I used it yesterday. It's Rick Warren in the Purpose Driven Life, where he says, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking about yourself less.
Mm.
And I think that really speaks of the value that we have. So we're still incredibly valued, um, but actually we need to think about ourselves less and take that humble approach, working in God's strength. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think some of the language around dying to self is difficult, and can be easily misconstrued. Um, but really, it's about allowing God to have control and God to be God's power to be evident through us, rather than ourselves being the ones that are evident. Yeah.
Mm. I love that. That's such a helpful way of expressing that. I've often wrestled with that around humility, and especially if you're, as a minister, if you're offering pastoral support to someone who is perhaps struggling with their self-esteem or their self-worth, and then to give them a Bible passage that could be construed as actually you need to not think about your own needs
Yeah.
or your own desires because that's not important. I love that. So that was humility is not about thinking less of yourself, but about thinking of yourself less. Is that right?
Yes.
I'm going to
Yeah.
hold on to that and write that down. Thank you. Thomas, what did you think?
Yeah, I love that quote. That's great.
Yeah.
I think it can be very. I found I think people of faith, it does make you a bit sometimes quite self-centered, really. You know, if you've got a narrative where you are thinking about, okay, it's about your actions and your personal relationship with Christ, and this is very important, but it does center yourself quite a lot in that. So I'm very attracted to an idea that says, think about yourself less, think about the wonder of God more, and as expressed through all of creation, not just you. Um, so I like that a lot.
Mm,
There was a couple of things I liked from here. I thought that there's a few kind of binaries going on, or a few spectrums between life and death, or kind of being depressed and down, or risen up, and then crucified or resurrected.
Mm.
And I find it quite helpful to think of these as almost spatial. If we're thinking about bodies and bodiliness, that comes up quite a lot in this. That baptism is a kind of bodily action, a bodily sacrament, and the movement of Christ from cross to grave and back and then up. I think it's very helpful to see that as a spatial movement. It makes you think of the the kind of gravity of it is it's much more physical. I think that's helpful to overcome a bit of kind of dualism between your body and your mind. You know, sometimes we
Mhm.
get very I think it's similar to what you were saying, Kathy, that it's very kind of in your head, but really, I think living out faith and living out justice should be in your body through the way that you interact with the world, and that is a bodiliness. Anyway, I like thinking about that as a kind of general thing for the way that we think about faith, that it shouldn't be in your mind, it should be embodied. Um, and I thought that cropped up in this passage. So that was quite a nice point. We've been thinking about JPIT about the concept of sin, and sin is it's a concept that we I think don't use in our communications very much, or you know you won't see it on the website as a kind of theological concept very much. And we were slightly wrestling with this because that feels like a bit of a gap, and we want to have the confidence to really think about collective and structural sin from the systems that we see and that we work against. You
Mhm.
know, whether it's the way that the process for refugees works, or the infrastructure that keeps the climate emergency going and isn't solving it. You know, these kind of big collective systems that we live within and a part of, but are also above us. Defining how do we think about that through the language of sin, in the way that people feel enslaved as a result of them. And I think that's quite nice in this passage because it's it once you have that concept of sin, it can be quite freeing to think about ways of approaching the world as a kind of justice-seeking Christian. You know, that it is about your individual kind of freedom from being feeling a slave to sin or feeling dead to sin, but it's also about how that interacts with everyone else, right? I think that fits with what you said, Kathy, that it's about almost thinking of yourself a bit less and thinking of the bigger things more. Um,
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
quite helpful.
Mm.
There's the other thing that I liked here was thinking about baptism. I looked at a resource called Working Preacher, which is a Lutheran um, I think it's a lectionary based resource, yeah, from the Lutheran Church in America. And that specifically drew out the idea of baptism, which I thought was an interesting point to focus on in this passage because you might skip
Mhm.
past it. But actually, it is, from verses 3 to 4, that's quite an important point. And it really made me think about refugee baptism. It's something that, given it's Refugee Sunday, or Refugee Day, sorry, World Refugee Day, I know it's something that we as JPIT have thought about quite a lot because it's been this political issue. You know, the idea of um, kind of refugees being baptized to prop up numbers in the church is a talking point that the media has used and that we've had to respond to as JPIT. And it's definitely something we're thinking about. Um, for me, because I've been to lots of different church events recently across our denominations, and something that's come up is so many people have talked about the refugees that have joined their church community and that process of baptism being really important for them, and it being a sort of symbol that was important to them, and important for them to be included in the church and to express their faith in Christ, but also for the community to show that they are a welcoming and inclusive church, that they are welcoming to refugees. It's a really important marker, and I thought that was quite nice to think of baptism can be really expansive, and that for a certain context, for example, a refugee being baptized in a church in this country, there's a lot of meaning there, and perhaps meaning in a different way than someone who's not a refugee. You know, someone who's been at this church their whole life. It's still important, but it means something different, and we can really think about these sacraments or these elements of our faith that in some ways are quite normal, but we can reframe them in a really helpful way to think about justice issues. And again, being a bit countercultural and saying, no, we're going to be welcoming and we're going to show that through our sacrament of baptism. Um,
Mm.
yeah, there's a few really nice points in this passage, I thought.
It's really interesting. I feel like there's a real resonance, Thomas, between something you said and something Kathy said there. The spatial thing,
Mm,
and baptism. I'm always struck in baptisms when I ask, well, the person or the parents, the godparents, the two questions: do you turn away from evil and do you turn towards God? And to
mm,
me, that feels like a real movement. And I always have this image of them just spinning on the spot. Because Kathy, like
Right.
you
Yeah.
said earlier, that is a lifelong thing, isn't it? We don't do that once, turn away
Yes.
from evil and towards
mm,
God.
Yeah.
we might have this one-time experience of justification, but then that process of sanctification is a lifelong
Yeah.
turning away from evil and towards God and making that choice every single day to be sort of spinning on the spot in that way.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting link between the things that had struck both of you.
Uh,
Before we come on to Matthew, Kathy, was there anything else you wanted to share about either of those passages?
um, I think the thing that came through for me in both of those was the humility aspect and that just continual nature, as you said, of our learning. And I think um that sort of sense of opening scripture daily, and saying what has God got to teach us on a given day in a given situation, and being able to be open to that, and I think that really sort of gives us that space to say what is God saying in this time and in this place, and that might be different, very, very different at different times, and that we might be called to respond differently in different places. And I think I'd made a note of this under the Matthew passage actually, but that process of sanctification that you mentioned, Naomi,
Mm.
it fits with C.S. Lewis talked about little Christs, that we become little Christs as we seek to become more like Jesus. We'll never ever reach that sort of attain that level, but we are little Christs in our little spaces, doing the very best that we can. So I think that sort of ties them all together in some way.
That's brilliant. I want to thank you for leading us very neatly onto the Matthew
Yes.
passage there. Shall we come on to that? And Kathy, did you have other thoughts about that you'd like to share?
Well, I really like this passage actually. I mean, I think it's difficult. There are some really difficult concepts within it, but just that sense of Jesus sending out the disciples. So this is where Jesus is sending them out on a mission trip, if you like, at the beginning of chapter 10, and he gives them authority, he gives them power to act, to heal disease, even to raise the dead. And then he says, just before you go, there's one or two other things I'd like to mention. And it made me reflect, when you go on a mission trip as a young person or something like that, and you get a huge long kit list and list of instructions of things to take with you. And actually, in this instance, Jesus says, prior to this passage, don't take a load of stuff with you. Don't you're going out just as you are. But here are the instructions. Here are the things that I need you to know before you go, so that you're ready. And really, it's saying that in being united with Christ, we are likely to face suffering, and that we can't get away from that. Um, Even as justice seekers, in relatively safe country, we're still likely to face persecution, and suffering. And it made me reflect on a time when I was called a do-gooder by a taxi driver. And, and the taxi driver asked me where I was going, and I explained that I was going to a church event, and he said, "Oh, what will you be doing there?" And I did explain what it was about. He went, "Oh, you do-gooders," and actually, I thought, do you know, I'm quite happy with that. There's worse things I could be called, and actually, if doing good is something to be critical about, well, I'm quite happy to take that. But yeah, I mean that's a trivial example, really. But we will face opposition in so many ways, and we've talked already about climate, and I think about peaceful protesters that are being arrested and things like that, just for speaking the truth, um, acting in a peaceful way, and arrested in the course of doing what they feel passionately that they need to do. Um, what else did I have for this? Oh, three times in the passage, Jesus says, "Do not be afraid." In my translation, "Do not be afraid," or "Fear not," if you're reading a different translation. And I suppose that there was much for these people to fear at the time, that Jesus was speaking, but there's much to fear today in different contexts, isn't there? And I was thinking about persecuted Christians in different parts of the world who fear death just for speaking about Christ, just for meeting together. And I don't know whether you've come across Open Doors, the charity. I looked it up actually. Their figure at the moment is 338 million persecuted Christians in the world, and Asia seems to be top of their list, their watch list, where we're called to pray for Christians all around the world. North Korea being top of that list. So I suppose reflecting on that type of persecution as opposed to the type of persecution we may face in the UK is a little different, but all relative to the situation we're in. Um, and those do not be afraid words that Jesus has. Don't be afraid, because everything will be known, everything will become fully known, will be revealed in due course. Um, and then the second of those do not be afraid um, speeches is a little different. Don't be afraid of human persecutors. And Thomas, I think this comes back to a little about what you were talking about body and soul. Don't be afraid of people who persecute the body. Be afraid of people who persecute the soul.
Mm,
People who will come after our souls. And being able to almost separate those two things. It's our souls that are the eternal part of us. And from a salvation point of view, it's our souls that we need to be mindful of. So being less afraid of bodily persecution, although actually I imagine being afraid of bodily persecution is pretty scary if you're in that space where that is a reality for you. And then finally, again, picking up what we said earlier, don't be afraid, you are valued to God. And we have that lovely passage about the sparrows, about God caring for all of creation, the human and the non-human world together. It reminded me of the words from Jeremiah, chapter 11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And that sense that God knows us in detail, that God values us, and that God has plans for us, regardless what's going on at the current time. So
Mm.
yeah, quite a bit in there.
mm.
I don't. Do we want to talk about peace? Um, about not bringing peace in a sword, or do we want to have a bit of discussion about the first part?
Well, I wondered whether Thomas might want to respond, especially some of the stuff about being countercultural. That really resonated with what you shared earlier. Do you want to respond to any of Kathy's points, Thomas?
Yeah, couple. Well, specifically when you mentioned the sparrows, one of the again, I use this preaching resource from the States, working preacher, and they mentioned something I thought was interesting is the sparrow. I think we think of sparrows as quite, don't know, almost like a stand-in for just sort of lovely nature, quite nice, and that's true. But also at that in that context, the sparrow was small, cheap, and to be eaten. Like it was not. It's
Yeah.
the point is also that God even cares about the things people don't really. Sparrows were everywhere, and I think it's like saying pigeon.
Mm.
It God cares about the things in that He has made in our world that we don't, and that made me think about the omniscience, and ever presentness of God. That's also it's an affirmation, but it's also a bit of a warning. It's that you can think about Jonah, can't you, running away, but having to come back. I think it does link to that call to do countercultural things because we find our lives through losing the lives of the world. That the things that we find value in, perhaps the sparrow, are the things that the world doesn't really, that doesn't really care about our creation or our nature, that is quite happy to profit from, pollution and exploiting nature, for example. That we say, no, that's actually, we can be quite confident from this passage from the we should not be afraid, verse 31. You are more value than many sparrows. We as humans are really valuable within the, and if God values the sparrows, he must really value us. So
Yeah.
I really like that. I think it made me think a little bit about how you think about peace as well. That was the thing I mostly talked about. If you'd like to, do you want to talk first, Kathy, about the verses 34 to
Yeah,
37?
absolutely. Gosh,
Yeah.
I think when you first read these words, it almost seems like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Mm.
Um, I was thinking about the passage in Isaiah about turning um, swords into plowshares, and this seems like a reversal of that at first glance. But actually, I mean, we know that's not what Jesus was intending. This is not about violence. This is not about swords in a very literal sense. Um, and I thought there was two sort of main points around this. And the first was around almost a cycle of peace, um, and how much peace we know now and how much peace we'll know in eternity, and that sort of peace not necessarily being the absence of conflict. Peace doesn't mean that we all agree on everything. We can disagree peaceably. Um, I think that the quote is peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of God, and that you find peace despite what's going on. And I was reminded of a book I read quite a while ago by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was in the concentration camps and suffered horrendously, but found meaning and purpose in God despite his horrendous circumstances. Even in that suffering, he was able to find peace because he knew his life had purpose in God. Um, and then the second part really was around Jesus really bringing disruption. Um, I think you can't get away from the fact that Jesus turned things around, that countercultural nature of Jesus that we've talked about already. It was disruptive in amongst that way of being in society. Jesus talked about the first being last and the last being first, and and really challenging people to do things differently, not to cling to old ways of being or stay in the comfort zones. And for me, I think the comfort zones represent something of the family that Jesus talks about, separating family. Um, I would say family is probably where I feel most comfortable. But I sense a bit of a call here to step outside of that comfort zone, um, to to be separate when separation is necessary, um,
Mm,
and that God's peace will come, but first there will be this disruption that not everybody's going to agree. Not everybody's going to think that what we are saying is right, or that it's the way forwards. So that there will be difficulty. And I think again that's what Jesus was saying at the beginning of this passage. It's not going to be an easy ride.
Mm. Mm. Thank you. Thomas, you had some thoughts about peace as well, didn't you?
I think yeah. I wanted to look at the word sword because I think that might be it. We can kind of let that slip a little bit into thinking of sort of violence in general, but I think it has to be more specific than that. That the question is who has the sword? Is it Jesus himself? Is it something that we have individually via the Spirit? This kind of call to say we're going to be resolute, maybe not physically violent. I don't think that's what we're being called to do, but to be, quite maybe even aggressive in the way that we advocate for our faith. Is it about that? Is it something that we kind of co-create with God as disciples? That we have this sword, metaphorical sword? I'm not really sure, but I do think it means the poor and the marginalized, coming back to what we were thinking about, those suffering oppression, we think that God has a bias to the poor, that God particularly loves and is alongside in the act of Christ's crucifixion and suffering, is alongside the marginalized. And I think that has to guide us a bit. There's a couple of examples I wanted to bring of world examples that I know of. Shane Claiborne from Red Letter Christians, who's kind of prominent justice-y evangelical. One of his ministries was in Philadelphia, where they created, referencing the passage you mentioned, Kathy, uh, they took street guns and made them into garden tools. So they
Oh,
carried out that work. They beat swords into plowshares. They made tools for community tool sheds. Um, that's a very different kind of sword, though. It's almost an anti-sword. It's still militant. It was quite hands-on. It's physically um, doing blacksmithing on guns and being really determined about it. But it's quite a different way of thinking about it. The other one is, um, I think we do have to slightly reckon with how we think about violence, though. I don't think it's necessarily from this passage. You don't have to bring the violence into it as a concept, but it is also important when we think about the violence in the world to really reckon with it. Do we understand people suffering violence? What is their right to self-defense? I think in light of the encyclical about AI from the Pope, that comes up in there, right? He talks about what is a just war, and that there can't be a just war, between states anymore because of nuclear weapons, classically, but also kind of autonomous weapons driven by AI. And this is something JPIT's done some work on, and our future of arms work from a couple of years back that we will be expanding because the pace of AI development is coming on so much that we know that there is, automatic target selection for missiles in Iran, for example, and probably in other conflicts. So we really need to think about who is labeled as a legitimate user of violence, who is a combatant that can use it, who is labeled as a terrorist, who is labeled as a freedom fighter. And I think an example I think is interesting is in 1831 in Jamaica, there was a war that was known as the Baptist War, which is for our Baptist listeners quite a striking title. But it was about a revolt, a slave revolt of people who were enslaved in Jamaica, revolting against their enslavers, starting out as a strike. But then there was some violence, and some of the people who were running the island, who were white enslavers, were killed. And that was led by a Baptist deacon called Samuel Sharp, who had a famous quote, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live my life in slavery." That's a different level of living out the kind of difficulties around thinking about peace and violence and martyrdom in the face of that oppression. And I think when it comes to those sort of examples, it is tricky to the way we think about nonviolence and the way we think about who is Jesus empowering to feel, able to resist oppression, and how do we kind of think about that without saying it's okay to use violence, which obviously can't be in a statement on its own, but it does have to be contextualized, and I think it's very difficult. And I think that's something the Pope, I would imagine, in the future will address in future encyclicals because it's such a pertinent question when you look at kind of conflicts. So I think it's a tricky passage as a result of that as well. But I also think that there is some justification for that from the first couple of verses as well, because 24 to 25, a disciple is not above the teacher nor a slave above the master, is a radical message of equality. It's really thinking about that. It's not just about kind of, oh, no one's above each other. It's saying no, we're all together, we're all equal, right? It's a very radical message. It would have been at the time. It would have been completely turning the world upside down to have said that all people are equal. That just wasn't a concept. There wasn't an understanding of universal human equality or universal human suffrage. It just wasn't there. So we do have to reckon with difficult things.
Yes, it's definitely a really challenging passage, isn't it? And thank you for wrestling with all those really challenging points for us. I'm sure that will be really helpful for those who are preaching on the 21st. And I think the question about how we resist and how we survive oppression is a really helpful bridge to the Genesis passage that we haven't touched on yet. So if we can come on to that. Kathy, I know that you said that you'd want to use the Romans and the Psalm as a sort of backdrop, then come on to the Matthew for all those really chunky reasons that we've been talking about, and then come to Genesis. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this passage.
Yeah, and reading them, I guess, out of order, and it really brings us to a bit of an example of this story lived out, sort of the resilience, the survival, God's intervention in that story, and there's the sense in which Hagar goes to the wilderness with absolutely nothing. In the same way that Jesus is saying to the disciples, go with nothing. Hagar actually is doing that as well. And when she reaches that lowest point, she is rescued by God, taking us back to the reading from Psalms, that rescuing God intervenes in that space. And um, just an interesting note, really, that the name Ishmael means God hears, or God will hears. That God hears the marginalized in society today. God hears, God sees, and will intervene in those spaces. Sometimes it's not in the time frames we would expect, but God is active in those spaces at all times. And just very briefly thinking, I've been reading a book called Just a Sister Away by Renita Weems. She's a womanist theologist, um, and it was interesting. She'd said that God responds to Ishmael's tears, not Hagar's, and I hadn't really noticed that before. Um, just as that sense that God responds perhaps not through the people we expect, that perhaps God will intervene through our children and young people, that God will respond through their crying out. And you think there's so many young people who are active in justice seeking across a whole range of topics, but not just young people. I think it's that unexpected nature. We might expect God to respond to Hagar as the mother, but actually he responds to Ishmael's tears. So that
Mm.
looking out for God working in unexpected ways through unexpected people, I thought was really profound.
That's really interesting. And I'm so glad that you brought womanist theology in there. I'm sitting here with womanist theology books next to me. And Hagar is such an important figure in womanist theology. For any listeners who haven't come across it, womanist theology is theology done by Black women out of their experience, because there was a feeling that a lot of feminist theology was very much grounded in the experience of white women and white women of a certain class, and so wasn't representative of that sort of intersectionality of the lives of people who were experiencing discrimination because of their sex and because of their nationality or their race and because of their class. And so Hagar is such an important figure in womanist theology because she experiences slavery, she experiences being driven out of society, she experiences so many different forms of oppression. She experiences very bodily oppression, with her body being used by Abraham and Sarah in a really terrible way. So yeah, as well as the book that Kathy mentioned, Sisters in the Wilderness, is a really key one for looking at the story of Hagar by Dolores S. Williams. Thoroughly recommend that one. So thank you for mentioning that, Kathy. Thomas, what did you make of the Genesis passage?
Well, I also looked at Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Women is God Talk by Dolores Williams. Or a really good Substack called Moments of Ponder, which did a little analysis of it. I would go and have a look at that. It was open access, really interesting, and it said a few lovely points about thinking about land as well. That there's a kind of the present Hagar's presence in the wilderness shows there's a care for people and land together. That she's kind of nourished by the land. She, you can imagine her in that wilderness. It's not about kind of punishment. It's about being with God and actually being lifted up out of that position, that God comes down into the wilderness with her. There's a real care there for her and the land together. And the link Williams made was between kind of forced surrogacy of black women as enslaved people and servants, of having bodies objectified as Hagar does. But actually, there's this process of transformation where Hagar is transformed despite that experience, and that's really powerful. The other specific word that you mentioned, Kathy, thinking about listening, was the Working Preacher blog said the Hebrew word used for the word hear in this passage specifically connotes active listening. It's shema, not passive listening. So it's not God as sort of patriarch sitting away. It's God alongside, following with action. Um, it's an active process, and that's there in the Hebrew. I thought that was really nice, because you again you want to distance. I don't think we want an image of wilderness as punishment, or of being separated from God, of being scapegoated, to use from the Exodus. It's not about that, is it? It's not about separation. It's about closeness, and that's a powerful point. I think that we should this is a good example where a passage that sometimes gets used to justify suffering as well. That has been used as a cited example of, I don't know, some sort of moral sin that Hagar is assumed to have done, and that this is a form of punishment. And it's really important to challenge that, because, as we've said, from a womanist theological perspective, it's very much it goes against that. It's not about punishment; it's about divine presence. Was the sum up quote. Yeah, I thought it was not something I'd gone into deeply before in terms of this passage. So it was really nice to read, and reframe it. And again, it's about thinking of the space, I think. When are you imagining a wilderness that's sort of barren, or are you imagining a wilderness that's full of God's creation and God's presence, and where she can really, the wandering is God seeking, and then God responds. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. I find this such a challenging passage, and I think you're right, Thomas, that there are things we need to challenge. Often readings have Abraham as the hero of this story because he's the
Mm,
patriarch, but actually this is even with God's reassuring, this is a terrible thing to do to
mm.
Hagar and Ishmael, and putting them at the center of the story gives it a very different feel.
Yeah.
Kathy, were there other things you noticed and you wanted to draw out of the Genesis passage?
Um, nothing sort of particular. I think it just ties through everything that we've already said um about social structures and expectations and that finding new life with Christ. I think that sort of threads through all of this. And that, as you said, Thomas, that divine presence that never leaves you, and that is constantly at work, even when we don't see sort of the outcomes of that immediately. Yeah.
Yes, and like you said earlier, at work with perhaps the most unexpected people.
Yes.
And we get the story of
Yeah.
Hagar going out into the wilderness twice, don't we? Because it happens in
Yes.
Genesis 16 as well.
Yeah.
And in that story, she becomes, I think, the first person in the Bible to name God. In
Yes.
conversation with God, she names God. And that sense that God is that close, like you were saying, Thomas, that presence. God is that close to this person who has been oppressed in so many different ways and driven out and is in this really desperate situation. And she has this incredibly close encounter with God and finds the means of survival through God. And like you were saying earlier, Kathy, are we sometimes falling into the trap of looking in the wrong places, not seeing God at work because we're looking at the wrong people?
Mm.
Mm, yeah,
Yeah.
it's really
Thank you so
wise.
much. Is there anything that either of you haven't had a chance to share about any of the passages?
I don't think so. I think we've covered quite a lot, haven't
I
we?
think
There's
we have.
there's probably several sermons in these passages.
I know, I kind of wish I was preaching on the 21st now.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thank you so much for everything that you've both shared. I've come away with lots of recommendations for reading and listening and quotations that I'm going to write down and pin on my desk. So thank you both. That's been really, really interesting. And thank you to everyone who's been listening and who's joined us for the podcast today. We hope you found this helpful and stimulating. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please do share this episode with your friends. And JPIT has online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. So thank you for joining us today. We hope this has been helpful to you, and God bless you. Thank you.